I'm Frederik. I work for Novartis. My day job is not to do with biobanking in any way, so part of my talk will not have anything to do with biobanking. But what I do is I work in the Nordics, look at the innovation in our pipeline 5-7 years ahead, see how that fits into the Nordic healthcare systems, and then try to analyze how can this help address some of these societal needs and needs in the healthcare systems, and what can we do to build a bridge between that innovation and the patients? How do we actually make sure the innovation reaches the patients? And a big part of that is making sure that decision makers in the healthcare system have evidence at hand to really demonstrate value for the right patients. What subgroup of patients will we give a benefit to? What is the burden of disease, the burden of illness? What is the cost of standard of care, and so on? So we work a lot with evidence generation in general in the Nordics. And a big part of that is also not focusing on what we can do today, but where we want to be in 5 or 7 years. What should we be able to do in 5 or 7 years when we talk about evidence generation? I come from a work of clinical trials, basically. You'll have a talk after me on a public-private partnership called Trial Nation we've set up in Denmark, so I won't go too much into that, but that's a public-private partnership I've worked on for 7 years, where we try to improve the framework for doing clinical trials in Denmark, try to make Denmark one of the best countries in the world for clinical trials. And this is one arena of evidence generation. We also have the real-world evidence space that's probably much more familiar to you guys working with biobanking as well. You probably link a lot to registry data, but where we've also built public-private partnerships about access and how to do this responsibly with society to the benefit of patients. But one of the arenas where probably we haven't really started, in Denmark at least, in a big scale, is the biobanking space. And I hope we can kind of tap into that a little bit today. I'll go through this very briefly, but my communications manager says that I should always start with 1 or 2 slides on Novartis. But basically, we are a big multinational pharma company, and our purpose, as we phrase it, is to reimagine medicine. That means really through innovation, new technologies, insights into disease pathways, biology, really reimagine how we can treat diseases. And some of the places where we're breaking ground is in gene therapies. We've launched the 2 first gene therapies in Denmark here over the last 2 years. Radioligand therapy in cancer, molecular glues, protein degradation, stuff like that. We're a quite big company. Last year, our drugs on a global scale reached 769 million patients. So it's a big machinery, and the core of what we do is R&D. And at the core of R&D is insights into biology, right? If we want to treat diseases that we can't treat today, we need to understand the biology. And this is where biobanking often comes in as well, both in terms of just understanding disease progression, but also patient trajectories and subgroups and what really drives this. We're mainly focused on these 7 areas. I won't go into details with this, but just so you know, this is roughly where we mainly play. We have a lot of early projects outside these areas as well. When we look into the future, we look into a lot of challenges in the healthcare systems. So the pointer here is there. So you all know this. We've heard this repetitively in all talks that start. We have an increased burden of elderly that will have multiple chronic diseases at the same time. The expected annual average growth in healthcare spending is 5%, which is unsustainable if this continues. But at the same time, the rate of innovation is really high. We're roughly bringing twice as many drugs to the market, or treatments, as we maybe should call them today, because not all of them are drugs today. It can be digital treatments, or it can be cell therapy, where you take cells out of immune cells out of a patient, reprogram them, and re-inject them and get them to target a cancer. but the rate of innovation is really big, and that's because our understanding of biology really is improving. And then the whole kind of digital health is also exploding. And that's both in terms of like personalized health and your own app-based, how you monitor your health, but also in how we use health data to look at disease progression and find the right patient groups and measure the burden of disease and so on, and find out where is there value for patients in innovation, and then focus our efforts there. In the Nordics and Novartis, we've worked over the last few years with a number of private-public partnerships. Here's just a few ones. One, Connect, I'll come back to. Fingen, I'll come back to as well. Foundation, yeah, you'll have talk later on that. And this one, I don't have a slide on further on, so I'll just speak a little bit to that. But in Sweden, we have in one of the regions built a public-private partnership with the region and a few private healthcare vendors in terms of kind of building a telemedicine approach to treating heart failure. And why are we doing this with the public sector? And why are the public sector doing this with us? It's because they have capacity problems. They simply don't have the resources and the manpower to actually treat the entire patient pool. So this is a place where some of the private companies have capabilities to actually help address some healthcare needs. The public sector has a huge interest in actually increasing capacity. But how do we work together? And how do we find each other? And that's where these public-private partnerships, if you go to them with, let's say, trust in each other and a solid discussion of the governance structure up front, and how do we actually manage the risks, the value, the ownership of these things, we can actually do this in a very meaningful way. The Connect program in Norway is on how we're bringing precision cancer medicine, how we actually implement that in clinical care. Because this is not a plug and play drugs that you place on a shelf and then the healthcare system can take down the shelf and treat the patients. These are cell therapies where we need to take cells from the patient, transport them to a Novartis facility, back to the patients and so on. You can't implement that in care. Just it's not very simple. So you need to collaborate around this. But in Norway, they've built a clinical trial at kind of the center around how they implement precision cancer medicine. So they have 17 hospitals and 15 pharma companies working together on one clinical trial where we actually monitor the implementation as we go along, generate the evidence as we go along, because you can sit and wait for the evidence to appear, and then we'll have implemented these drugs in 10, 20 years, or we can actually start implementing now and follow up real time and do it together in one common protocol, and then monitor how it works. But it requires that both sectors, the public and private, collaborate on doing this, because we can't do it alone. The public sector can't do it alone. Fingen, I know you had a talk about it yesterday, right? So I won't go too much into that. We weren't one of the founding partners and in it from the start, but we've joined later on. Again, it's a great example, and also very relevant to the biobanking space, of course, where we take some of the unique resources in the Nordics, right? So our health data and the, let's say, acceptance of the public to actually engage in these things and have a political landscape that allows for this, and build a platform together, a research platform where we can link the phenotypes and genotypes on a completely different scale to what we can do before. For us as a company, this gives us unique insights into biology, what drives diseases and so on. But for society as well, this leads to better treatments down the line. So we have a common objective and a common foundation to build on. Another example in Denmark is, and sorry that the slide is in Danish, but it's a public-private partnership called Data Saves Lives. And you'll see that, we'll just go back. The collaborators down here, there's a lot of pharma companies, there's some IT companies, there's some AI companies, there's the municipality of Copenhagen, University of Copenhagen, the two regions here in Zealand that's responsible for the healthcare system in the Copenhagen area and beyond, and the University Hospital of Copenhagen. But the idea here is actually quite a simple public-private partnership, where we talk about what utility health data has, how it can benefit society if we become better at using it. We have a wealth of health data that's collected in Denmark over many years, and we have across the Nordics. And we're really good at using it for their primary purposes, right? So a reimbursement for a drug or a diagnose code so that the patient can be referred, or a code that for the activity at the hospital so the department can get reimbursed. But for secondary purposes, we have legislation in place that allows for research, which is good. There's some great work coming out, even here from Serum Institute going back in the days, also recently, of course. Sorry, but I mean, one of the really good examples is one of these studies that linked the risk of autism with vaccines, right? So there's been a lot of vaccine anxiety, also now with COVID, but before that around the MMR vaccines, right? And you give them to young children, roughly at the same age that many of them are diagnosed with autism. So somebody made a connection, and it created quite a vaccine scare. But how do you kind of push back on a vaccine scare? How do we actually get the data? Where do we have the data for such things? We have them in the Nordic healthcare systems. Where we have these universal healthcare systems, we know which kids gets diagnosed with autism. We know who got vaccinated when. And we'd actually make some quite nice analysis as to is there an increased incidence of autism among the vaccinated, and it completely refuted it, right? So on a global scale, this has huge implications for global health, that we can do stuff like this. But it's considering the potential of the healthcare data, we do it very little. So this partnership was around bringing all stakeholders around, together who are interested in using health data and saying, okay, what are all the barriers? Why aren't we doing it better today? And some of them are legal, right? And then we say, okay, why are these laws in place? Well, some of them are created 20 years ago, before digitalization of the healthcare system, for a different purpose, but they apply to this area. I mean, should we change something? We can start looking into that and then lobby a little bit for that responsibly. Some of them are around process, right? So we need to go through ethics committees. You probably need to do that a lot for the BioBanking projects as well. But how well resourced are the ethics committees, right? Your applications can sit in a pile for 6 months, while we in Denmark invest billions in healthcare research that has to go through ethics committees. So a lot of these applications, they just sit 6 months while we wait as an industry. We're quite impatient, because if it's at a time where we have patents, time is actually quite expensive, because we'll have less patent time at the other end. But also maybe for some of you as PhD students, if you have 3 years for a PhD and your application sits 6-9 months, I mean, we have a common interest to kind of bring down those things, and how do we work together to make that happen? So we analyzed a lot of different barriers for use of health data, and where we agreed, public and private sector, made some catalogs. We created, we had a lot of analysis done from different consultancy companies in this. So one is kind of, what is the value to society if we were able to activate the health data? Also in terms of generating evidence to make better decisions so in the healthcare system. So if we do have a knee injury, do we operate or do we send for rehab, right? It's not a lot of companies who are interested in doing that kind of research, but it's incredibly expensive for society to have these patients. And we don't know what actually works best, but we actually have data that could kind of work towards this, right? So if we can make informed decisions, we can also save resources in the healthcare system. And how do we monetize those? Then there was a legal analysis of what are all the legal barriers. Questionnaires for patients and patient organizations. How do they view the use of health data? Is it their health data? Is it society's health data? What can we use it for? For what purposes? What is legitimate? When do they need to get asked? When do they don't need to get asked? What is acceptable? We had some events. We created a report with kind of 3 major solutions that we see could help right now with the current structure, with the current legislation. What are 3 simple things we could do to really improve the use of health data in Denmark? And these are all ended up in the new life science strategy. I think Jacob will also speak to that later on. So they're part of the government strategy for life science today, some of these initiatives, right? We had Copenhagenomics calculate, again, the value of health data. Also, if you try to monetize some of it, get investments from foreign companies, external companies, and then finally, map what is there, because the ecosystems for healthcare data is incredibly fragmented. We have 200 plus registries, lots of different data owners. They don't collaborate well always. I'm sure many of you have encountered that. So where is the data? What is the quality, and so on? And can we increase transparency around that? So all in all, this is not a huge public-private partnership. It's basically a discussion club where everybody working in this area comes together, discusses the barriers, and kind of looks at what do we need to have in-depth analysis, also so we can provide information to politicians about how do we change the system for the better of society. Trial Nation, I won't speak too much details about that. This is one of my babies, but this is a public-private partnership around creating better framework conditions for clinical trials in Denmark. So also, again, the same kind of analysis, bringing both academic and private partners that do clinical research together, talk about barriers, create solutions, implement them, apply for funding. So now we are in the state budget with Trial Nation. So we have permanent funds from the government to work to improve the framework for clinical research in Denmark. And that helps us as a private company that wants to do clinical research, run our clinical trials in Denmark. But that also means we attract investments into Denmark, we generate jobs in Denmark, but it also helps all the academic researchers that do the clinical research. And I think during COVID, we've all kind of realized how important it is sometimes to generate evidence quite fast. And clinical research is just expensive and slow in general. So whatever we can do to make that cheaper, lower the barriers and faster, and improve recruitment. One of the big things that I'm really looking forward to, that we've just got funding from the government, is create a national database where patients and doctors can see all active clinical trials in Denmark within all therapeutic areas, where to go if they're interested in participating. Today, access to information is actually not very good. It's all public, but it's not easily accessible or comprehensible. So just making that easy for patients to get access to trials. For us, that means higher recruitment rates. And that means that when we compare, it's a global competition in Novartis where we put our trials, the better we look in Denmark, the more trials we get. So we need to recruit better. I need to speed up. Finally, we have two other projects, public-private partnerships. Right now, we're building where we've applied the Danish Innovation Fund for funds to actually kickstart it and do a pilot. And I think the biobanking area is really also an area where there is a big need for reimagining how to collaborate and how to build systems or gateways that really both helps academic researchers, but also private researchers and does matchmaking.
We actually have to 10 o'clock. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just thought half an hour and I thought
talk about BioBanking.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks. I mean, that was kind of some of the activities we have in the Nordics, and we're just one pharma company, right? So there's a lot of other things. On a European scale, you're probably also familiar with IMI, Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is built to build partnerships in health. They have a budget of 5.3 billion euros to support public-private partnerships, solve health problems or challenges in the health space and innovation. And us that work in the Nordic organization, we're not part of a lot of IMI projects, but I just did a search where Novartis was from our global headquarters. And this is just from the two first pages of 10 pages of hits on where Novartis is a partner and what kind of projects they're involved in. So it's everything from developing biomarkers to developing patient-reported outcomes in specific diseases or new digital endpoints. How do we quantify itch digitally? So, I mean, today if we do a clinical research, we want to quantify itch. It's a visual analog scale. So patients say on a scale from 0 to 10, how much does this itch, right? But can we quantify that digitally? And can we validate that so we can use it in a clinical trial with much better precision than these analog scales? And some of the things are kind of it's a activity monitor on one wrist and an activity monitor on the other wrist, and you have a dominant hand, right? When you scratch yourself, you use your dominant hand. And during daytime, it's really hard to evaluate what are you doing with your hands. But during nighttime, at least most of what you do with your hands, I'm not talking about all the time, but most of the time, what you're doing with your hands is actually nothing except if it itches. And that only happens with your dominant hand. So by looking at the difference in activity during night times between your hands, we can actually start measuring itch and quantify it. But I mean, this may sound like a small problem, but in terms of clinical trials and how we actually evaluate efficacy of drugs, this is something that's really, really valuable, because all these visual analog scales that are patient reported, there's a lot of variability in it. That means we have to run really big trials to actually detect meaningful differences. And really big trials are really expensive. So, I mean, all kinds of things, problems, innovations in the healthcare space that can make us better at generating evidence, at addressing societal problems in healthcare. I mean, we built a lot of public-private partnerships. There are some in the biobanking space also here, or some of them are maybe not platform initiatives or gateway initiatives, but more like within a specific disease, we need a new biomarker for this, or stuff like that. But there is stuff ongoing. The problem with IMI, in my mind, is that they're big, bureaucratic, slow projects. They take 5-7 years. It's a lot of work. But it's just for reflection that there's a lot you can do, and if you can scale to a European scale, there is some EU funds that could be used. So Lasse asked me for this talk just a simple question, right? How can we do better, simpler, more agile collaboration between industry and private companies? And we can't. Not in the short term, but in the long term, we can. Because this will require that we start bringing all the stakeholders together, talking about what is the structure today, what are the limitations, what are the barriers, where do we create value for all the different stakeholders across, what is the value of biobanking, what can we use it for, what societal problems, what health problems can we use, can we solve if we do this? And then kind of build a partnership around that and saying, okay, how can we address some of these barriers? How can we build platform or gateways, as Fingen is, for instance, in Finland, where we look at what is important to the different stakeholders in driving their research? And how can we build models around that? But building private partnerships or public-private partnerships takes time. It's really, really hard. Of course, there can be some small quick fixes, like just increasing transparency about what data is available. What samples are available. We have a good registry in Denmark, and I've tried to get Novartis to work on the Danish biobank using some of their samples when we have some research questions we want answered. So I contact some of our researchers in Basel, in Switzerland, that I know have a problem. They need to develop biomarkers and study disease progression in the disease. But they want samples from patients diagnosed with this disease, and they want samples where they have longitudinal lab values going back 5-10 years of protein excretion, for instance, urine samples. So how do we know if we can if we have these samples in Denmark? Well, we can look up in the registry saying, yes, we have enough samples with this diagnosis, but we can't see how many of these samples do we have the lab values going back in time. And then I say, okay, it's likely we can do it. It's very likely we have these samples. Okay, and they say, okay, fine. How long time will it take until we have the samples? Well, first we need to do a real-world evidence study where we link the lab data to the diagnosis data to find out which patients we actually have that data from. That in itself takes half a year to do, because we need approval from ethics committee to do this, right? And that's just to do the feasibility, to know if the samples exist. And then they run away scared and saying, okay, in the UK, we can buy samples where we have the relevant registry data that's fit for purpose, and we can get those in 3 weeks. Right? It's much more expensive. And the data that you can get to accompany the samples is of worse quality, and you can't link it to all sorts of other things if that becomes interesting down the line. But it's fit for purpose for what they want to do now. So basically, they don't come to Denmark because that process, for us in the industry, time and removing risk from that feasibility process, knowing is this project even realistic? It needs to. I mean, we need to be able to do that in 3 months max, 2 months max, maybe. If we don't implement systems where we can do this, it's going to be really hard to attract industry to do studies and use the biobanking facilities. And how do we get to that place? Well, let's come together. Let's discuss. I mean, what can we do? What will it take? So on, and what will the societal benefits be? Because we need to lobby for legislation changes or funding to ethics committees or whatever it may be. We need to have a good case to go to the politicians and saying this is needed. These are the changes that are needed to create a good framework, a good infrastructure to work with biobanking. But it's a long process. Trial Nation that you're going to hear about afterwards. It's 7 or 8 years since we started that process. And at that time, it was a growth initiative in Denmark. So the government wanted to attract investments from the industry. So they put aside a pool of money to actually create a public-private partnership. I think we could have done it without the money. But the money was really, really good in attracting the academic partners into the conversation, right? Because some of them were skeptical. What do we want to do with the industry? Why do we want to collaborate on this on a kind of structural scale? Why don't we just do it on a study-by-study scale? But that pool of money really kickstarted it all and brought people to the table. I think we can do it without the money, but it requires that everybody agrees that we can do more with biobanking, that we can create more value for society, for the healthcare system, for research, if we build better framework, if we build better structures around this. But what also really struck me during that process is that, and I think it's a little bit sad, is that it's the Ministry of Commerce in Denmark. It's a growth initiative that's driving this thing to attract investments into Denmark, and that's nice for us. It's fine. It creates job. It's value for money. There's a return on investment for Denmark in that. But I think the big value, the real upside, is for patients. It's for society. It's for the healthcare system. Why isn't it Ministry of Health that's looking into how can we build better frameworks to create a learning healthcare system where we use research, to make better decisions tomorrow for the patients? In my mind, it's a little bit reactive. They're very much focused on the budgets this year and how do we optimize resource use this year, but not in terms of how do we actually create a better healthcare system in 10 years. And many of you guys, you're the ones that are going to help create a better healthcare system in 10 years, right? The research that you do is going to be the foundation for a lot of things that are going to benefit patients down the line. But if we don't build good infrastructure for that, we're not going to get there. And we need to collaborate on that. Maybe I already spoke to this. But there's another point in this, and that's there's a lot of relationship building in this. There's a lot of trust in this. And trust is a hard thing when you collaborate between private and public sector. Who's doing what are the motives? Why are they here, right? And it takes time, and it takes time to find the right collaborators, the right stakeholders to bring together around the table to discuss this. I also think, Fingen in Finland it's been a multi-year journey to get where they are today. It's not something you do overnight. It's not, and especially if you're looking for investments at a certain scale where the private sector, if it's big amounts beyond in-kind contributions, we place studies here or we provide manpower to help drive the initiative. If it's big investments that you're looking for, then it's a really big lobbying effort. And who's going to do that? Who's going to bring all the stakeholders together to start this? Because it's going to be a several-year journey where there is no payoff, right? You're all busy people. So who's gonna start, right? We need somebody to step forward. We need people who engage in this space. And I think this is actually, 15 years ago, as a PhD student, 12 years ago, I thought I was going to do basic research all my life. But what I discovered later on is that I think I can do more value in building partnerships, frameworks that can support other people, right? And I think we need more people in that space that think beyond and think where we can be in 10 years and what we can do with platforms, gateways, and coming together on a common agenda. I think we have so many things. I mean, we are a private company, and yes, we need to satisfy our stakeholders. We need to turn a profit, but we can only make a profit if the solutions we develop create value for society. We can't sell something to society that doesn't create value to society or to the patient, right? So in that respect, we have the same goal. We need to develop solutions that can benefit the patients at the end. And then but this is an interesting thing, or an interesting one, right? And it gets quite complicated. So what can we do with samples that are taken back in time, routine samples where they didn't give a consent? What can we do? What should we do? I mean, is it unethical to use it if they haven't consented to use it? What if we could do it anonymously? What if it creates value for something? Is it unethical not to do it? I mean, it's a really hard discussion. And the external world, the citizens, they often have an opinion. If it's informed or not, depends, right? But there's going to be a lot of opinions. And if you ask politicians, if we go back 5 years about our discussions with them about can we become better using health data for research in Denmark, when we went to politicians and asked, is this something that you're willing to look into? We had one-to-one meetings with them. They explained it. They say, yes, we see the value. This is something important. We should do this, but I can't say this in public. Because it doesn't drive it drives less positive votes because nobody really cares about the upside here. It doesn't really concern the citizen that we do this. It's a small thing, but there's a few or a subgroup that is profoundly negative around this. So it drives negative votes. So we have a dynamic there that is hard to work with. Even though they see the point. And if you ask patient associations, they see the point. They are pro. But it's also one of the upsides of the public-private partnership on health data is that patient associations have also started becoming more vocal about, yes, we want this for our patients. It's actually, we're more upset that you're not using our health data. That's the biggest problem, or it's starting to become. So there's a lot of things there, and it's a process. It's not something where we can sit together. I mean, we're not representative of society and what we want to do with research, right? But we need to involve the right people. We need to talk to them. We need to get them to understand what the upsides are, what's the value for them, so they can also speak on our behalf in terms of building good framework for this. And if we can't convince them, then we shouldn't change the system, right? Then there's the legal space, right? And I think a big challenge there is some old legislation, conflicting legislation from different domains, and then different interpretations of legislation. And I think at the moment we're struggling a lot in Denmark with interpretation of GDPR. So maybe some of you have experienced that. If you want to do a study across Denmark in several regions, and you want to do a contract and see how we process the data and who owns and who does what, and you send the same application to different regions, they send you different replies. Some will accept it, some will decline it, but they can't agree themselves on the public side how to interpret GDPR, and then you're caught in a deadlock, and that deadlock can take, unfortunately, years to get out of. This is one of the biggest data barriers in the health data space at the moment is interpretation of GDPR and the delays it causes. and the frustration it causes. And some projects never materialize. Some we give up even before we start them because we can't. I mean, it's hopeless. PhD students sit for 1.5 years, have to redefine their PhD project. I mean, all sorts of things, right? But again, here, this is a place where we can lobby together towards the people who can actually address this and see, can we do something about it? And the Danish regions have just started a working group to kind of address that problem, to get one national interpretation of GDPR in terms of health data research. It's going to help us tremendously. But if we didn't have these public-private partnerships, it's really hard to get that message across to those that can change it. Because if we come as one private company and saying we want to change legislation, yeah, good luck. They don't want to listen to us, right? And it can be hard for all the different individual parts of the system to speak up. Is it my responsibility to speak up? Who does what? How do we? But if we come together as a public-private partnership, saying across the ecosystem, this is a challenge that needs to be fixed, and it causes these detrimental effects for health research in general, then people start to realize we can do something about it. I think I'll end there.